Hello, and welcome to Reuters Events' latest webinar. Today we'll be exploring the cost-optimal path for decarbonisation here in the UK and look at how companies and countries can drive towards their net zero and renewables targets. A reminder for everybody listening live that this is very much an interactive session, so do get your questions coming in throughout and we'll see how many of those we can get to. Without further ado, I'd like to pass over to your moderator today, Bjorn at Wärtsilä. Bjorn, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Owen, and welcome everybody online joining, and I hope everybody's safe and sound where you are, and maybe offer you a bit of a break from the regular routine of being locked up somewhere due to the current situation. I have a very distinguished panel with me here today. I'll introduce them by name, and then they can tell some more about themselves in the first part of this session. We're going to do a bit of an introduction and a bit of a sort of position piece first, and then we'll go into a kind of a panel discussion around a problem-solving piece. As Owen said, please do use the Q&A actively, and we'll try to field those questions as we go. Without further ado, let me introduce the panelists I have here with me. We have Kate Bragg, we have Jane Dennett-Thorpe, and we have Ville Rimali. And why don't we start with an introduction here from Ville. We are of course colleagues in Wärtsilä, and we have put out a paper specifically related to the UK market and the potential to do some quite substantial cost savings. It generated a bit of interesting news coverage in Forbes. And why don't you just touch on the main points of that report, and then we'll invite the other panelists to put their positions up. Ville, go ahead.
Yes, thanks a lot, Björn, and good morning, good afternoon from my side as well. And I wanted to start this session with a really positive note. It's good to remember that UK is really ambitious on decarbonisation targets. They have set the highest target in the whole Europe, aiming towards 68% carbon reductions or carbon emission reductions by 2030. But as you mentioned, Björn, we have been conducting some of our studies as well, and we have generated some interest in the media as well, which probably tells that people and public, general public is looking to get facts and different views for this energy transition, which is not that trivial nowadays when there is so many moving parts. And the first piece, what we did was this Energy Transition Lab report based on the pretty comprehensive modeling of the UK and European power system. And we actually learned that pushing faster renewables and combining that little bit flexibility in terms of gas engines and energy storage, you can reach 62% renewables pretty easily. This should be maybe target already around 2025. And you can at the same time save significant amount of money compared to if you're looking only renewables, or even more if you are comparing what if you build renewables and 3 gigawatt of additional nuclear. And I think the main question around this report is that, and comparing these findings against the energy white paper published in UK just late last year, that is UK looking the easy solution to decarbonize, or is it finding the optimal but a little bit more difficult way to reach these decarbonization targets? And why I'm saying so, it's we look at from another angle, that if you would like to build the whole UK system now from the scratch and build it immediately for 100% renewables, you would build 90% would come directly from renewables, mainly from wind, then you will use around 10% from flexible gas, and obviously on the later in the transition you shift that to run on the green fuels, and of course some batteries are needed for shifting as well. And if you look at from this picture point of view, you are not seeing many of the technologies which were part of the energy white paper, namely the nuclear and of course the carbon capture. And reason why we see that those are not necessarily part of the end solution is the cost. The green fuels and the renewables are overtaking these more traditional technologies, carbon capture and nuclear. And then basically when you fine tune your optimal 100% renewable system, then you are not seeing those, and there is risk of the stranded assets, which we are obviously not willing to have because we still need massive amount of investments for the power system. And then basically the last angle what we have been looking is the stimulus and money. There has been a lot of debate and a lot of encouraging positions from politicians that we really need to drive this green stimulus. But unfortunately, thanks to energy policy tracker, we recognize that currently the politicians are not really putting the money where the mouth is. And you can see that currently still 5.5 billion of stimulus money is used for fossil, and at the same time green is getting roughly 150 million only in UK. And just imagine if that whole 5.5 billion would be used actually for the green. That would be easy to leverage with private money beyond the 15 billion. And that would mean, based on our calculations, around 100,000 new additional renewable energy jobs and really significant additional emission reductions compared to today. So these are kind of the data points why I claim a little bit that UK may be looking at the moment the easy solution for the decarbonization, really ambitious target to get 68% reductions by 2030. But we need to understand also that what is needed on the long term and what could be the cost optimal way to reach the decarbonization targets.
Thanks a lot, Ville. Really sticking your neck out here, I have to say, and I like that, and I hope this will sort of set the scene for a good discussion. I would love to hear now from Kate Bragg joining us from Statkraft from that perspective, and what's your view on this, and maybe I'll offer you the opportunity here also to shoot holes in some of Ville's points here.
Excellent. Well, let me start with, I'll start with a brief response to Ville's or Wärtsilä's report, and then also explain who we are and our perspective on this. So I think in general on the Wärtsilä report, we think it is super ambitious, but we also don't think it's impossible to achieve. And we think it's kind of in the right vein for our times, in that 2020 might have been a terrible year for most of us on a kind of personal level, but on a renewable energy level, it was a fantastic year, right? It supercharged the growth. We've seen the EU Green, we've seen China seeking to find climate neutrality by 2060. We've seen the US coming out now by 2050. We've seen lots of green shoots of hope. And I think I would say Wärtsilä's report is of that same vein. It's trying to drive us to think more sort of creatively around how can we make this transition happen, because it is challenging, but it's not impossible. So who is Statkraft first? So I'll give you some context. So we are the renewable producer in Europe. We have a strong heritage in hydropower. So we own about 25% of Europe's reservoir capacity with a large market operations. And we have a strategy to become one of the world leaders in renewable energy. And that's across wind, solar, hydropower, and hydrogen. And we're aiming to invest about 1 to 2 billion euros annually completely in green production. And so we have, although we're based in Norway, we have a presence globally, and we've been in the UK since 2006. We own 5 operating assets, and we have a number of projects that are about to come online from this year onwards. So so we're fully invested in helping the UK in achieving its ambitions. I hope that this debate raises some interesting questions. I think there's first the question around how do we deploy more, and I think there are a number of challenges. I mean, we've seen solar capacity grow, 27 times in the last decade. I mean, the speed of change has simply been astounding, but there are quite a lot of barriers to being able to deploy that renewable energy, and we should talk about what they are and how we can best kind of take them down together. I think there's an interesting question around flexibility. So when you see the pattern of wind and solar in terms of production, there will always be a need for other products. Wärtsilä have suggested some. I think we would add more to the mix. We would talk more about battery storage. We would talk more about hydrogen, for example. And we also need to look at what we can use in the transition period versus what we can use when we get to the end state, whatever that is. And then I think there's also, when we talk about flexibility, it's also useful to talk about stability, because the grid is set up and has had a legacy of having more thermal production. And so how do we have a grid that can deal with all this influx of green, I think is a super interesting challenge, and one which I know the UK has been very forward leaning on. How do they bring in market solutions? So yeah, got lots of thoughts about all of those topics, but I'm excited to speak to this panel.
Thank you, Kate. Wonderful. We also have Jane Dennett-Thorpe here from Ofgem to bring the kind of the regulatory angle, and I immediately hear some overlaps with some of the recent released desires from Ofgem in terms of the national grid and that third party institution idea. Could you first, Jane, of course, welcome to the panel, and really look forward to hearing your angle on this. Floor is yours.
So thank you, Bjorn. Yeah, so really happy to be here, excited to join the panelists. Just to, I suppose, who we are, for not everybody might be familiar with who we are to start with. So Ofgem, we're the GB energy regulator. So broadly, we regulate, in particular, the energy networks, ensuring how much their investment, how much they can recoup from their customers to enable investment. We also regulate, in particular, the retail markets, other markets, to ensure that they deliver value for money for consumers. So about a year ago, we published our Decarbonisation Action Plan, which really, I think, for the first time brought together a lot of the work that we were already doing, but also indicated a path to the future about how we were really going to make decarbonisation and the path to net zero central to what we were doing. And it set out sort of a period of 18 months with some initial action. And since then, we've developed our strategic priorities to focus our work. And I think the first two of those really talk to the matter that we've been discussing so far and to the report. The first one is around enabling investment in low carbon infrastructure to deliver net zero. Much of that from Ofgem's perspective is clearly around ensuring that the networks are building appropriately for net zero, particularly electricity networks. And the second one is really to take a view to bring forward flexible electricity systems, because we're very conscious that to balance the systems, to keep the costs down, and as the level of intermittent renewables rise, we'll need full chain flexibility. So how we think about this is really from all the way through, from generation all the way through to consumers, all of them playing a role in delivering that flexibility, for example, on electric vehicles. Our other three priorities, I think, just to mention them, one of them is around a retail market with innovative products. I mean, there's a link there to this, the flexibility as well, and ensuring that we are seizing the opportunities for the new digitalized world. Again, there's links there, but there's also broader changes that are happening in the energy market that we need to harness. And the final one we've just mentioned, which is promoting energy system governance arrangements that are fit for the future. So really taking a holistic view and thinking, the future doesn't look like the past, and how do we help get it there? And I think people have already mentioned the speed of the transition, and I was looking at a piece of work done by the Carbon Brief, which I think is really powerful, which illustrates, it sort of sets out what in 2007 was said to be the future in the Energy White Paper, which at the time was quite forward-looking and quite a radical perspective. Actually, we far exceeded many of those targets, in particular on renewable, and we've taken coal off the system much faster than we thought. And I think, yeah, I heard someone say recently that acceleration becomes the norm, and I think that sort of certainly chimed with me, and it certainly has happened if you look back. So I think the final thought I meant in terms of the report, I mean, I think certainly the investment in renewables and the importance of flexibility are totally, I think they're incontrovertible. Peak demand is going to increase. We know we need flexibility. I think, just to kind of perhaps be a little bit controversial and to open some of the debates, I think one of the things though about an optimal pathway is not necessarily the lowest cost pathway. I mean, in Ofgem as the economic regulator, we consider our world in terms of thinking about the lowest cost transition. But I think we also recognise that we need to be pragmatic about this. Firstly, we'll never know what is the least cost transition. We won't know looking forward, because models are always wrong, because they include so many assumptions, and we won't know with hindsight either. But also, to deliver it, it needs to be something that has people's support, and also is robust to unexpected changes, as we don't know exactly what the pathway will be. So I think there's a number of different aspects, as well as just simply cost optimization, that we need to consider as we think about the future pathway. And my last reflection was really that when we do modelling, we need to be really careful about the boundary conditions. And actually, we're trying to get to 2050. And so thinking about what we need for that, what we need to 2030 on the way to 2050, I think is also a very important part of this. I think Kate alluded to some of those things already, and I'm sure we'll come back to them.
Great, thank you, Jane. That there's a lot of stuff there that I think we can dig into a lot deeper. I think we have to carefully manage our time. I want to take a bit of a break here and take some of the questions from the Q&A already related to some of the stuff that you guys have mentioned. A very straightforward one with a high sort of renewable concentration. Do you see any role for bioenergy, is the question from Kyriakos Maniatis. Kate, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, sure. I think so we have, for example, we're looking at different types of biofuel and whether we can produce. I think there is a role. I think there will be a place in the stack, providing it can be at a cost point that is commercially viable, at least for producers. I think we shouldn't rule it out. I think it will be part of many other options, and certainly could play a role in the transition. So I suppose my answer, a simple answer, is yes. I think it will be there. Whether it will play a very large role, I personally think probably unlikely, but I think it will be in the stack at some point. Yeah.
Another question is related to the word on everybody's lips right now, and certainly in European energy policy, is hydrogen, and where that's going to land. Maybe you want to field that one, Ville. What's going to be the role of hydrogen in this system? Yeah,
well, I think there were actually one question linked to that topic as well, and comparing the batteries and hydrogen. I think it's quite important to see difference. The hydrogen and batteries has quite different role in the system, and the kind of efficiency, if you shift with the batteries compared to hydrogen, will be always much higher level. But of course, the dilemma is that with batteries, you cannot just store your energy for weeks. So from those kind of technological facts, the batteries will be a solution to shift some of the daily solar, daily wind to peak demands at the evening, and do the intraday balancing maybe a little bit over 2 days. but then the hydrogen role will be more for the longer duration balancing. There is unfortunately more or less every country has some weeks when we have hardly any wind and solar, and then you need to have some stable power for those periods. And hydrogen seems to be one of the most promising solutions for that long-term storage, getting reasonable high efficiency on that shifting, and not easy, but probably doable to store some way.
Thanks, Ville. There are a lot of questions about alternative types of technology, and I saw both hydro and deep geothermal, and some things that are probably a bit more on the innovation spectrum, certainly for the UK. So is it fair to assume that this beyond 2030 horizon contains an element of uncertainty around the technology that will be deployed as well? What would you say, Jane?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that is exactly the case. I mean, there is a degree of uncertainty, but I don't think we should either be paralyzed by analysis. I wasn't suggesting that, or that we should kind of wait until everything is certain. I think what we have to do is to plan for what we know is needed, and ideally what we know is needed in the long term. So definitely renewables seem on a variety of, almost however you cut the cake, we are going to have, more cheap. Renewables are now the cheapest way to generate our electricity, or will pretty much and very soon be so. So we will have more renewables on the system, and we will have to respond to them with some flexibility for the lowest cost system. It's sort of, it almost comes from the physics. This is my background.
Yeah.
And despite working for the economic regulator, I tend to think economic efficiency happens when economics has closely aligned to the physics. So we will need some flexibility, but I think the questions then are, which are the ones that look like they are most suited towards a transition to 2050, actually? And so we are doing some work around thinking about, despite the uncertainties, which ones of those, and how can we ensure that particularly demand side, this full chain flexibility is joined up to ensure that transition.
You mentioned here, I just wanted to pick up on that. You have, as Ofgem, you have, of course, the perspective for the whole sort of from all the way from the generation source to the consumer. Can I just get your view here on kind of reversing the flows? There's been, especially with regards to electric vehicles and vehicle to grid kind of, what is the, what do you think will be the role of that sort of mechanisms down the line?
So I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what will be the role. I think this is exactly one of those uncertainties that you point to. But clearly, if they can play a role, then we are in a lower cost world, that if we can use existing assets or assets that are needed for other purposes to play a system function, and if we can make that work without detriment to consumers, that would be advantageous to all consumers ultimately. But how do we regulate that? How do we get there when the technology is so nascent is a challenge for us.
Right. Super active Q&A here, and we will try to do our best to field these questions as we go along. We talked a lot about here the kind of the capability of the grid to manage a very high renewable share. And I think you mentioned it, Kate, here, that even though 2020 was a miserable year for a lot of people across the board, it did do something about the renewable share. So also in the UK, where you saw unprecedented levels of renewable share in the generation, and I guess. Results show that the grid was quite capable of handling those levels. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Jane is probably more qualified to comment, but let me give my perspective and I'll hand over to her. And together we'll nail the answer. I think it is impressive how it copes right now. I also think it's impressive how the UK is thinking ahead about how do you deal with these challenges. So, for example, we as a company, Statkraft, have been involved in things such as like rotating stabilizers and battery energy storage systems. So more innovative solutions that try to help the grid cope with what would have been provided by thermal generation and now isn't provided by intermittency. So I think it's, and the UK government is putting those things out to the private sector to try and provide a solution, which I also think forces more innovation and also forces more good solutions. And hopefully, I would say that that kind of attitude also should help things like storage come more online, right? If there is more incentive for it to be built into the grid, great, then there will be more private actors. But what we have seen in 2020 is there is not a shortage of investors wanting to put money into green solutions, right? If anything, that has just gone up through the roof. So I think if there's things like, I think if the UK is willing to spend a bit up front to be able to try and put mechanisms like rotating stabilizers into the system to help with shocks on renewable energy, then it should help long term to reduce the cost of integrating it. And I think that's kind of what the Wärtsilä report is also saying, right? There are mechanisms within that. I think too often people think that it is just costly to add renewables into the grid. I think it just needs a little bit of innovation, and we can actually make the cost kind of have an economic perspective long term that makes it worthwhile placing that investment now to make it integrated into the system going forward. But I don't know, Jane, if you hopefully agree.
Yeah, I think no, exactly. Okay, I think that makes sense. Exactly what you've said, and I think, I mean, I suppose this sort of relates to my. I think modelling is really helpful and it helps us guide action, but we shouldn't be too hung up on the details of it because, for example, one of the things that is probably going to change alongside, you know, we're going to change the physical infrastructure. Surely be a parallel change that comes alongside this must be what exactly we're paying for and how we are paying for it when we are using energy, because we are changing the fundamentals of how we are making energy and the kind of functionalities that we need to see. And as a result, we would expect to see sort of changes in the market sort of arrangements and the relative values of different market sort of signals. So yeah, but I agree, Kate, with what you said.
That's an interesting point. I want to pick up on that and maybe give Ville a perspective on this, because ultimately, you know, the consumers pay the price, and the consumers also vote, and the consumers also you know, want to see a sort of you know, a resilient model where they don't have to worry about you know, security of supply. When we look at this, Ville, what's your view then on the you got a bit of challenge here on the assumptions in our modeling, and what's your view then on that societal perspective of total cost, so to say?
Yeah, maybe I could start a little bit explaining how we try to understand this COVID situation. Of course, this was kind of a stress test for the future. Of course, it was really extreme change. Suddenly, significant part of the load was gone, and the renewables jump with 20-30% just more or less overnight. Of course, the positive thing was that lights stayed on more or less everywhere in the Europe. But if you start to look at more in detail, there is certainly some challenges to be solved. In Germany, for example, they have a lot of neighbors, so they can use them as a little bit as buffer. You saw that always when they had a high share of renewables for certain hours or day, they pushed those to neighboring countries, ramping, even the price was heavily negative. So they basically paid to get rid of this excess power. In the UK, of course, kind of the system was, or the COVID was not expected, and the plans were done for with different assumptions, and basically there had to be the arrangement to compensate some of the baseload generation to stay away, because renewables typically have a priority dispatch in the different systems. So this is of course one learning which we should somehow take into account when planning the future, that the plans are really needed where way or another to kind of see on the longer perspective what could be ahead, and make really the solutions which are the cost optimal. Because if you start to do this firefighting, those are actually quite significant monies, and if you actually use the same money to solve the situation you should not do for many years, this firefighting, and you have already gathered the money to fix it permanently. And I think related to previous question as well, that which are there, should there be bioenergy or geothermal, nuclear, all these technologies can be part of the system. Then the bigger question is that what is the potential scale? Bioenergy has some limitations on that, and of course then the bigger question is the cost. And at the moment it really looks that the wind and solar together with batteries, and of course the missing piece is this long-term duration batteries or hydrogen bridging solution that has maybe the most uncertainty. What's the winning technology for that?
Right. Thanks, Ville, for your perspective on this. If we then move to the sort of the second part of the panel, where let's sort of bring out the magic wands and the assumptions. So we have essentially 3 questions here that we want to look at closer. So how to speed up renewables integration. I think Kate, you already mentioned some of the financial, the financial sort of angle here about investments really flowing in. Then the second question is how to get more flexibility into the system to make sure that renewable doesn't disrupt the system itself, and then what to do with basically assets that don't match that flexibility. If we start with you, Kate, on that, how to accelerate the sort of renewables build up?
Yeah, I mean the simple answer is build more, ideally wind and solar, but that's not a particularly interesting conversation. I think maybe it's worth looking at like what are the barriers to allowing it to happen right now, right? So one of the biggest ones is how do we handle intermittency, and we can cover that in flexibility. There's also simply how do you just build that much new infrastructure, right? There are barriers like grid connection, land permitting, land availability. I mean, they're all legitimate kind of barriers that occur in any kind of infrastructure, and that will effectively limit, if we don't support it, that will limit the growth of more renewables. But I think there's also a couple more interesting ones. What's the route to market for these products? So, and by that I mean, if governments have set big ambitions, so a lot of European governments have done that, like the UK, we probably expect to see more auctions coming on. How do you manage auctions? How do you participate in them? How are you successful in them for the companies building out the renewable energy? And then I think there's an interesting one about the trade. I think it's we should be very mindful. There is a trade for these things. So biodiversity concerns, nature concerns, people's lives and living near these, they come with a trade-off. And I think we have to listen very carefully to communities and to the wider societal implications of building. And then other things that could help speed up would be more end-of-life solutions. So we are going to see wind parks starting to come towards the end of their life, the early wind parks. Can we look at solutions to try and renew them? We're looking at some in Germany, that's an option. Or hybrid solutions, like Ville was saying, like more batteries being built into wind and solar from the start, because it just allows more flexibility long term. So I suppose that's a mixture of challenges and opportunities, but I think that's probably the kind of space at least we should be talking about to try and increase deployment at the moment.
Great. So a bit on the sort of on the policy side with regards to grid, to land, environmental permits, a bit on the sort of market side, some on the technology side. Specifically interesting, I noticed in one of the Q&A here was that what happens to all of these wind turbines that reach end of life? And today, I think we've all seen the Bloomberg reports of them being just buried in massive landfills, which I don't think is particularly pleasing to anybody. And then you also mentioned the social aspect of that, which is of course very interesting. And if I can ask you, Jane, to comment on this one, then on those topics, do you see any other sort of barriers to accelerate the build out of renewables, or do you want to comment on the dynamic that Kate outlined?
Yes, I mean, so I think obviously there's a whole range of issues that Kate's alluded to around the increase in renewables. Many of them Ofgem doesn't really have a locus on, for example, on access to finance and such like. I mean, either that it's government policy or undertaken by private actors. So really, where our intersection is particularly here is around networks. And I suppose, just thinking of one place in particular where we are taking action to try and address this together with government is thinking about the massive build out of offshore wind that is required at the moment. There's something like 10 gigawatts installed offshore, with a government ambition, as you all know, to reach 40 gigawatts by 2030. Now, that's quite a challenge. So in particular, we're working with government and other stakeholders and the industry to see how we can ensure that the network infrastructure is in place for 2030 and frankly beyond. So we're looking at the offshore transmission network review to ensure that we can both think about a more coordinated approach to those developments, so that we can be more, so that the process can be streamlined, and in particular so that the transmission assets are available and at least cost. So I think that's part of it, is also the joining up of different parts of the system. Sure.
Yeah. Ville, your view on this one?
Yeah, kind of speeding up the renewables. I agree what Kate you mentioned, and maybe adding a little bit for this, how to encourage investments. The fact is that electricity markets, spot markets, the average prices are going down. It's just fundamental fact when you add more solar and wind bidding at zero price, and you need to build the scheme to support renewables. Similarly, UK has built a capacity mechanism for thermal generation already. So it's from that angle fair to have something to support renewables. But it's important to remember that this is something different than feed-in tariff. Now we are not getting the renewables just to get and scale them whatever cost. Even we are running these auctions, we know that the kind of complete cost of or levelized cost of electricity over the life on renewables is cheapest compared to any another technology. So it's just like we are splitting the revenue stream for different sources for renewables. They are getting a little bit from auction and part of the revenue from market. So it's needed, but it's completely different thing than giving a feed-in type of support for renewables. It's still leading towards the optimal system. Of course, combined then with flexibility, so that lights stays on all the time.
Thanks for the bridge to the flexibility angle, Ville. I think to what extent do you see, maybe just a quick around the table here, is the current level of flexibility a constraint to build out more renewable? Kate or Jane, do you want to comment?
I mean, at the moment, specifically in the UK, no, that is not the. And if we're talking about flexibility, is in providing within the intermittent. So when wind and solar doesn't produce, providing in there. Not currently. I mean, I can see from our experience and from Wärtsilä that it can happen. Sort of by Jane's logic, though, that we are not static. Like the grid and the systems and the production will evolve over time. So we can't just assume where we are today will be exactly where we are tomorrow, for example. Yeah. I also think if we start bringing in, like I was saying, more hybrid sites anyway, we're going to end up with more flexibility coming on. And I think there are a ton of solutions coming online, which help. Which I don't think you also need to say that, like, there is renewables, which are intermittent. There is wind and solar that is intermittent. There are also renewable choices for flexibility as well, which can come on. There are things like interconnectors between different markets. Hydrogen, Ville has mentioned. We've got battery, we've got virtual power plants, we've got EV charging, which Jane said. A lot of it will happen as well on the demand side. I think it's worth thinking that it's not just a supply problem. Actually, we can cure a lot of this with better demand side management. So do I think it is a problem? No. Do I think it is something we have to keep solving? Yes. But yeah, so I don't think we're negative about it. I think it's an ongoing challenge, right, to make this work.
Maybe before you comment, Jane, if I can maybe specify the question a bit more, is that we saw here, for example, in both in UK during the spring, there was many months of coal plants not producing at all. We've seen in Germany that there was also especially during the COVID sort of demand slump, that they had to essentially offload a lot of renewable capacity at negative prices to, for example, Norway, because they could not ramp down essentially their nuclear and coal assets further, because it becomes economically unviable for them. So my question is more, is that installed base now a limitation because of the adverse effect it would have on these actors? Jane?
So I feel that others in the renewable industry are better placed to answer if it is currently an issue. I understand, to some extent, a functioning market does mean that at times you pay lots for certain things that you don't need most of the time. It's that doesn't by itself demonstrate that things are not working. But I think Kate summarised it quite nicely. It is a challenge, and it is a challenge that becomes bigger as we move forward. It's not going away. We need to keep looking for solutions to this and building solutions to it, or either building the business models and the infrastructure for it. So Kate's also talked about demand side response, and I mentioned it earlier in terms of EVs as well. I think part of the challenge here really is to figure out how much can we use, get flexibility out of the existing system by ensuring that consumers, whether they're domestic consumers or industrial consumers or others, are playing their role and being incentivized and compensated for playing an active role as part of that system. How do we structure that? So, and I think if we look to 2050, we have got quite a lot of gas on the system already, and that is at the moment a solution that is being built for flexibility, but it is not the solution that is 2050 compatible. So I think the challenge is really, how do we maximize the other sources of flex rather than build any more gas plants that have a limited life? In a 2050 world, there's no gas without CCS.
Got it. Ville, any comments from your side here? I know we have been as a company also, of course, commenting on the UK's plans to build out nuclear capacity.
Yeah, well, of course, looking from positive angle, again, the COVID was kind of a bit eye-opener and giving hint of the future. If looking the battery energy storage, they made the most money ever in UK market and many other markets when there was suddenly much more price volatility. And of course, this is signaling that more flexibility is needed in the system. And we have seen quite good momentum that there is more and more developers looking to put batteries, and also similarly flexible gas. And I fully agree, Jane, that this is kind of transition solution, this gas. And of course, companies like Wärtsilä, we are working hard to find the solutions to transit these assets to run on the hydrogen or another green fuels when those are available. And of course, we recognize that the decarbonization targets are putting really timeline pressure, and we are not talking, at least in Wärtsilä, anymore the 2050 horizon. I think the transition on the power system can happen in many countries much earlier than 2050, and we want to be ready. Of course, what comes to nuclear, if you need to balance the renewables, if you have kind of fixed part of your system, nuclear at the bottom for 20 or 40%, you have less room to maneuver with flexibility and balance the renewables. And what we learned in this study, what we did last year, that actually going beyond on 60% renewable share in UK, even with just current the nuclear fleet, it's really difficult. And it's kind of choice what need to be then made, that of course both are leading decarbonization, nuclear and renewables, but one is renewable, one is not. That and there is quite significant cost difference. Of course, nuclear big benefit is that it's needs less space, and it's 24/7 power what you can get. But at least when we have done this cost analysis, including the flexibility what you need and balancing with renewables seems to be the cheaper alternative, and that seems to be the way in another European countries.
Great. We are slowly coming to time here, and really good and active discussions on the Q&A. I want to pick up on one here, which I think is sorry, Jane. Did you want to reply to that?
So I just wanted to reply. There tends to be a little bit of sort of throwing things over the fence between nuclear and renewables, and I think, look, the reality is they're both inflexible supplies. In their own ways, their own different ways, they are inflexible. They do not respond to demand. And I think when we talk about full chain flexibility, I suppose this is what I wanted to come to. It's not just about supply side flexibility, but to think actually that what the flexibility systems need to do is to link up demand and supply. At the moment, we worry about sort of peaks, but what we need to do in a future world is to have supply when there's no. We need to have some energy when there's little supply on the system, new generation on the system, and we need to be able to put to use excess energy rather than pay for it to be curtailed. That's the challenge, the future energy challenge.
Yeah.
As I see it.
It's a really good point.
Yeah, and I agree as well that of course consumers can play much bigger role, and of course when we talk about hydrogen, then that kind of producing hydrogen can be seen as source of flexibility as well as a big one.
There's a comment here from Philip Scrivener. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right, but probably not. What's stopping the government to transition this £5.5 billion subsidy to green or renewable sources of energy that's currently being subsidized to fossil? How would the panel recommend that this is accelerated? Maybe you can start, Kate.
Thanks.
We aim to please.
I'm not sure I'm not sure I'm the best placed person to think about this one, to be honest. Am I allowed to throw it to Jane for a little bit to have a think about it, and then I'll pass the hot potato around? I mean, it's kind of a government call, right? Like, I know where I'd encourage them, but it's ultimately a political decision, really. Like, it's not, I suppose, yeah, that would be one thing I would say. And it kind of comes to, sorry, Jane, and then it comes to like, there is the optimum, right? And there is, we are very much a company that is market-based, and we believe in the right market solution will solve it. Equally, with that massive pinch of salt, right? But we operate in a real world, and we also have to acknowledge that for some reasons, sometimes governments have to make calls that, you know, that they need in their energy stack for a particular reason or not. So there are always both sides to the argument, even though we believe that renewables are the answer on this. But anyway, Jane.
So I mean, I wasn't going to answer. I was going to say something very similar to you. That as an independent regulator, we are not government. We are working increasingly, trying to work together with government and also other actors, understanding that we and others don't deliver the energy transition by ourselves. But we are the independent regulator, and the government has to ultimately make its choices, its political choices about where to spend its money as a result of citizen kind of representation.
Yeah, maybe I can comment quickly as well. Of course, part of the subsidy is potentially used to ensure that countries and other industries are competitive against another countries, which is somehow fair reason to do it. But if you look at and think on the longer perspective, the fact is that the renewables are the cheapest source of electricity now, and the gap will just grow. And if you are not transiting this stimulus towards the renewables, then soon you are actually compensating kind of your more expensive power with fossil fuels against another country which probably run faster to renewables. So then the stimulus is not anymore driving the intention what you have had earlier.
I see we have the moderator's moderator is now here, Owen, to kind of wrap it up. If I can just offer one more round the table. If you had a magic wand, what would be the one thing you would do in 2021 to accelerate the sustainability of the UK power system? I start with you, Jane. We're allowed to make believe also. I think you're on mute, Jane, sorry.
Yeah, that's not unintentional that I'm on mute. The one thing that I would do with a big magic wand, I suppose, is to put all those renewables down that we need, and all the connections that we need, and that would be the starting point on all the flexibility, zero carbon flexibility that we need to support them.
Beautiful. Kate, how about you?
So alongside Jane's magic wand, my magic wand is going to get a bunch of companies to spend all of their time and resources thinking about hydrogen and thinking about batteries, because I think if we crack those two elements, we will be a long way along the route on the storage side for renewables. Thanks,
Kate. Ville?
Yeah, there were so great ideas from Jane and Kate. I try maybe combine those, and I would do the massive, let's say, 20 gigawatt auctions where you are willing to get renewables combined with some flexibility.
Thanks, panel. Thanks for all of the participants who have contributed to the Q&A. There was a lot of questions. I think we have 73 unanswered ones. So let's see if we can get to those or somehow pick those up afterwards. I'll hand now over to, so big thanks from on my behalf and to the panelists and to all of the participants. Owen, over to you.
Thank you, Bjorn. And yes, a huge amount of questions we couldn't get to. So we will circulate those along with the recordings as well, which will be sent out to everyone after the session. Once again, thank you to Bjorn and Ville, to Kate and to Jane for all of your time today. Thank you to Wärtsilä as well for your collaborations on this session. And thanks to everybody tuning in. A great session with lots of interactivity, and we look forward to welcoming you again. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.